New Testament historically reliable? Well, that is the question that we're going to seek to explore and indeed answer over the next several weeks as we look at the New Testament documents in general and the four Gospels in particular. To begin, we're going to look at the authorship of the Gospels, namely Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, from a critical perspective, critical scholars would say that the four Gospels were originally anonymous. That is to say, the person who wrote Mark was anonymous. It wasn't actually Mark. Or John, it wasn't actually John. It was an anonymous author. And the early church didn't know who wrote these Gospels for the first 100 years after they were written. All that is to say, these Gospels were in circulation for a century before anybody knew who wrote them. It wasn't until Irenaeus in AD 180 that we first know that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. Eventually, these names were added as superscriptions. They weren't on the original manuscripts. And these names were added to give these Gospels a much-needed authority, according to critical scholar Bart Ehrman. So, we needed Matthew to write Matthew because he was an apostle. And we needed John to write John because he was one of Jesus' closest disciples. And so, all that is to say, these Gospels weren't known for the first 100 years as to who wrote them. And they added these names, the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to give them a needed authority. I would like to contend that this view fails in just about every measurable way possible. Let's begin with the manuscript evidence for this view. We don't have a single manuscript that doesn't have the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John at the top of the manuscript. Some manuscripts are fragments. They only have a part of the manuscript. But all of the manuscripts that have the entire Gospel or the beginning, they have this superscription, kata Mattheon, kata Markon, according to Matthew, according to Mark. All of the manuscripts follow this. So we don't have a single concrete, physical line of evidence that supports the view that these were anonymous. Richard Bauckham, one of the scholars out of Ridley Hall in Cambridge, he says this. He writes, most authors gave their books titles. Yes, in the ancient world, most authors titled their books. This was a common practice. And so the Gospels were just falling right into line with the common conventions of their day. So too, this is an impractical theory. It is fundamentally impractical to view the Gospels as anonymous. Well, why would we say this? Well, Justin Martyr, who was around in AD 150 in the region of Palestine or Judea, he says that the early Christians got together to read the, quote, memoirs of the apostles. Well, I wonder what the memoirs of the apostles were. These were the Gospels, according to the earlier chapter 66. So this means that the early Christians writing or living in Judea, in Palestine in general, they were reading the four Gospels, the memoirs of the apostles, but are we really to believe that these people didn't name or title the Gospels that they were reading? They were just passing around documents without titles. Just think about how impractical that would be. You wouldn't know which book you were reading from any given morning as you were studying the scriptures or the biographies of Jesus' life. Frankly, it's human nature to title these works. And he's writing in AD 150, and he's saying that this was already a common practice. In addition, this is a view that I think should be rejected fundamentally because it is implausible It is implausible. The early Christians used these Gospels for a century, according to this theory, and these Gospels were spread across the Roman Empire. Christianity was a burgeoning a movement that was spreading like wildfire across the Roman Empire for a century, literally reaching into the millions of people by the 2nd century. And are we really to believe that during this same time, all of the later scholars, Papias and Irenaeus and Tertullian and Origen and later Eusebius writing the history of the church, and all of the manuscripts just so happened to get the names right for all of these manuscripts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Maybe you're not following. Matthew is never called Mark. Mark is never called Luke. Luke is never called the Gospel according to John. Better than this, Matthew is never called the Gospel according to Philip, or the Gospel according to Judas, or the Gospel according to Mary. Matthew, that document that we have that we call Matthew, it is always called Matthew by Papias and Irenaeus and the later scribes or later authors and those who wrote the manuscripts. So these documents spread into different manuscript families, and the scholars and Bible teachers spread across the span and scope of the Roman Empire, hundreds of miles away from each other, and all of them coincidentally knew which gospel was which. This is just wildly implausible for them to get this right. Let's look at this. This is a truly anonymous source, the letter to the Hebrews. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. So when we look at the manuscripts of Hebrews, we see something strikingly different. Look at this. In Papyrus 64, in the 2nd century, the letter to the Hebrews begins, "To the Hebrews." Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, this is the neutral text. It dates to the 4th century. It says, "To the Hebrews." It doesn't tell us the author, but look as we continue. Codex Alexandrinus, "To the Hebrews written from Rome." Or the 9th century, "To the Hebrews written from Italy." Or the 10th century, "To the Hebrews written from Italy by Timothy." Or "To the Hebrews written from Rome by Paul to those in Jerusalem." Or "To the Hebrews written in Hebrew from Italy anonymously by Timothy." This is what happens when you don't have an author written at the top of the manuscript. Scribes invent authorship. They tack on various authors or no author at all. What we see with the author of Hebrews is we don't know who wrote this. So the scribes tacked on various superscriptions, right? It's written by Timothy. It's written by an anonymous source. It's written from this location to this location. It's written by Paul. They're all over the place. With the Gospels, we see exactly the opposite. We see that Matthew is always the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark according to Mark, Luke according to Luke, John according to John. Furthermore, this view is unhistorical. When we read from the early church leaders like Tertullian and Irenaeus, we see that they highly valued authorship. Look at this here. This is from Tertullian writing in Tunisia in AD 210. He writes, "A work ought not to be recognized which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author." So much for the idea that they didn't care about authorship and that it could be anonymous. No, he's saying this is going directly in the face of the critical view, that they didn't care about authorship. The early church highly prized authorship and what is referred to as apostolicity. So, a book needed to be written by an apostle or written under the supervision of an apostle. We read from Irenaeus in AD 180. He says, "Those who denied Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were denying, quote, the companions of the Lord, not some anonymous authors, not some spurious authors, pseudo-authors, pseudepigraphical authors. No, these were direct companions and friends of Jesus, according to Irenaeus. And again, he's writing this, but he's clearly referring to antecedent historical tradition. That is to say, tradition that preceded him, that he got this from somewhere. He didn't invent this idea that the Gospels were written by companions of Christ, whole cloth. He came up with this because he learned it from someone that preceded him. Well, that's the big picture. Now let's look at the individual authors themselves. Let's begin with Matthew.